Hi, welcome to Actual Spinster. My name is Anna Marie, and today I think it's probably going to be kind of a long video because I've been doing a lot of research for this just to like check my facts, and also this is a topic that I care a lot about and I'm really interested in, and I also think it has like a particular kind of stake in I guess like the humanities and history and literature, like the development of those things. So yeah, basically it's going to be a review of No Modernism Without Lesbians by Diana Suhaimi. I'm going to start by talking in more kind of like overall terms, and then I think I'll talk more in depth about the four particular figures spoken about in this book and the various issues I had with the book as a whole, and also with some of the choices and the decisions about how people were talked about and what was represented or not. So first of all, this book is a non-fiction book. It's a biography of 4 women who were integral to the development of modernism as a very like simplified sort of overview, and those 4 women were Sylvia Beach, Natalie Clifford Barney, Bryher and Gertrude Stein. All of these people were queer in some capacity. I've said this before, I think it's a fabulous title, No Modernism Without Lesbians. It's also something I believe, so going into this book, you know, I should be like the perfect candidate to enjoy it. But this book isn't really an argument for the presence and the like integral nature of lesbians to the development of modernism, in part because it doesn't have a robust enough sense of what modernism even is. It just takes a lot of like, I mean, its definition of modernism is like a paragraph and it's really very bad which leads it to be very vague, and also to rely on basically like a particular kind of like male modernist to be an exemplar of modernism, which is antithetical to the idea that lesbians helped created/facilitated modernism. It sort of does come across, and I think it would be fairly easy to read this as a book that just kind of represents these people as sort of the handmaidens of modernism, like the financiers and the publishers of modernist experimentation, aside from Gertrude Stein, I guess, but there's a lot of issues I have with Gertrude Stein and the way that she's written about in this. I do also want to say that like this isn't an academic book, but there has been it's fairly easy to access a lot of information about modernism, and something called the New Modernist Studies has been around sort of since the 1990s, the 2000s, so that's like 20 years of scholarship that has been questioning some of the received wisdom that we have about like literary history and the development of modernism. And I feel like this book is like not at all really aware of that in any meaningful way, or sort of in any way that really materially has changed. Like I think this book could have been written in the 90s, like it hasn't been shaped by any new considerations. And like I said, I think one of the major sort of sites of that problem is that it has this really bad definition of modernism. It doesn't think about it very much at all, and as a result it means the whole book is way weaker. Another like key thing I really struggled with is the referencing in this. How it's done is sometimes in the text it will say like where a quote is from, but sometimes it won't, and then at the back of the book there's a section called Citations and Books, and then you have to go to the page number of the quote. So like on page 123 there's a quote that starts "The rhythms were new," and then we can look up and see where that is from. So it's a really annoying thing to have to do all the time. It allows Diana Suhaimi to like completely decontextualize a lot of the quotes she uses, which obviously is not the point of a rigorous biography of a group of people but also it's inaccurate. Like there were definitely a couple times where I looked to be like, who said that, like why are you quoting this here, and I couldn't find it listed in the citations section. So I think it was like pretty badly done, and definitely makes you not trust Diana Suhaimi very much, alongside many other reasons why I don't really trust her very much which I will talk about more later. You know, and there were also just like a couple times where like she just gets facts wrong. So for example, in the Natalie Clifford Barney chapter she talks about a throuple that was formed between Natalie Clifford Barney and Leanne de Pougy, and also, well, she says Lily de Gramont, who was like one of Natalie Clifford Barney's like long time lovers. She's like very non-monogamous, but that throuple was actually between Leanne de Pougy, Natalie Clifford Barney, and also someone called Mimi Franchetti. And there's even like a novel that Natalie Clifford Barney wrote, which is a roman à clef about that affair between Mimi, her, and Leanne de Pougy. And like, you know, it's available, and it's called Women Lovers or The Third Woman. So yeah, that kind of thing is really disappointing, and I'm sure there's loads of stuff that I didn't notice or didn't know that was wrong, if that makes sense. Much like the sort of title, which has a lot of like pizzazz but then doesn't have very good follow through, I think the whole book's approach to sexuality and gender also like is massively oversimplified, but also I just feel like Diana Suhaimi just wanted to call a lot of people lesbians, so she did. In the introduction, it does kind of pay lip service to the fact that like obviously queer identity is something that is relational through time, it's different, it shifts, we have really different conception of what identity or being or self is now. But obviously the modernist era is very interesting because one of the things that modernism is engaged with is like psychoanalysis and the developing sense of a self and of a subconscious and an unconscious, and thinking about those as productive forces in somebody's creative life. And queerness as part of that is obviously really vital in terms of like identifying normalcy or abnormalcy and stuff like that. Like it's pretty ripe in terms of like queer theory and interesting developments. But yeah, like I said, I think in the introduction Diana Suhaimi just like talks about some stuff. I was going to reread the introduction, but I'm just too tired to, and I don't want to, so I did read it a while ago. But overall I just remember it being really weird, and like the way that she talks about gender, both in terms of transgenderness and also just gender in general, also sort of leads this to be a very surface level book in terms of how it considers gender and sexuality, and also those positions, so being like a woman or being queer or a lesbian, as sort of political identities. Like it totally fails to explore the dynamic nature of those things. It's just lazy scholarship. Basically, I'm just saying over and over again that I don't think she treats gender and sexuality as any kind of complex category or categories, which she should, because they are. And yeah, so following on from that, its particular approach to politics is, I guess, where like my major qualms come about it, because I think it can be easy to like argue about who's a lesbian, who's bisexual and who's not, but that's not necessarily particularly productive. And I think our own personal experiences of our identity can really impact how we see and relate to people in history and what we want them to be identified as. And I don't say this as someone who's like separate from that. I obviously, you know, there are some people who I maybe have like a particular emotional connection to the idea of them like being a lesbian versus not, so you know, but I lost my point. Right, yeah, so back to the politics. No, actually, before I moved on, there was one other thing I wanted to say that is just like really uncomfortable, I guess, throughout the whole book. It's very clear, I think, to see that Bryher was not a cis woman. Whether she would have identified herself with womanhood in any capacity is, you know, I haven't directly read her letters or whatever, but she obviously has like a really intense and difficult relationship with being forced to have been a girl/woman. She writes about how she had this like massive disconnect. I was going to talk about this more in the Bryher section, but I think it's important to say now because it runs through the whole book, because Diana Suhaimi's whole idea is that these are like 4 rebel women, and yeah, I think it's a very high chance that Bryher was not a woman. Bryher wrote about how she always felt like her body was in the wrong body and she should have been born a boy. She was really frustrated with the gender roles that were assigned to her, especially as like a wealthy woman. Yeah, HD, who was one of her partners, would write like Dear He and Fido He as like pet names and letter openings. So, and I don't know whether that translated to being in real life, but what's sort of bizarre is that these things are quoted and referenced, but Diana Suhaimi just doesn't let it materially change what she's saying or arguing. So it's just like really weird and really uncomfortable, and I do think it's like giving you the information and then also sort of erasing that information's capacity to change the content completely. So yeah, just really weird, really bizarre. Yeah, I'm definitely gonna like read more on Bryher because I thought that she was interesting. So now we're gonna go back to the politics. So I think there are like 2 major problems I had with it in this capacity. One is that it downplays, erases and totally ignores the fascist sympathising, Nazi loving aspects of specifically Natalie, Clifford, Barney and Gertrude Stein, which I think is something that things about modernism often do, but at the same time there's a wealth of knowledge and information about the particular kinds of politics that these various figures were espousing out there that is readily available. So I think it's pretty cowardly to not talk about that just because you want to represent these women as like special queens of fighting the patriarchy. which also is the other sort of major issue I had with the politics of it. It has a really, really simplified understanding of what like fighting the patriarchy means. Again, it all just like suffers for it. You know, I think we can talk about these people and the way that they impacted literary history and, yeah, like textual forms and technological advancements in terms of like film and stuff like that, but we don't have to always say that they're like feminist trailblazers. We can just be like, these women were very interesting, fascinating people who contributed to culture and whose legacy is erased, and they don't deserve to have been erased. Like, you know, we don't have to be like, wow, what a girl boss. Because like, what does it mean to feminism to call a bunch of like wealthy fascist sympathizers feminists? You know, it doesn't make feminism look good. Another sort of dimension of this is obviously class. Aside from Sylvia Beach, who I think, I mean, was middle class, but whose like bookshops, Shakespeare and Company, did struggle to be financed. The other three people in this were all like independently wealthy. Natalie, Clifford, Barney and Bryher were both like unbelievably wealthy, like so wealthy. When Bryher's dad died, he left behind like a 2.5 billion amount, like pounds of money, and Bryher got, I think, about 30 million pounds. Again, this is like equivalent to today, so it was like 600,000 then. Like, that's an astounding amount of money. Diana Sihami really doesn't like the Bloomsbury group in this. There's like this bit where she like derides the Bloomsbury group for playing safe. Whatever their sexual orientation, their references were too oblique, their allegiance too strong to the rose garden and croquet on the lawn for them to threaten the fabric of English society. And I think that's very interesting. I mean, I do like what a lot of like the Bloomsbury group produce, so I guess I'm like sort of defending my interest in them, but more so than that, it's just hilarious to then think that like the rest of the people in this book also didn't have an allegiance to the rose garden. Like, they, you know, they all they all were like really, really wealthy people. I also think it's kind of hilarious to call like the Bloomsbury group like too oblique and stuff when one of the people you're talking about is Gertrude Stein. I mean, one of the reasons why Gertrude Stein gets away with like writing what she does is because nobody fucking understands her. So that's very useful if you're, you know, queer and you're writing about being queer, but in a way that is like pretty unintelligible to most people. She also does include like Radcliffe Hall as part of this like radical queer set, which again, Radcliffe Hall had a massive allegiance to the rose garden, you know? Now it sounded really gay when I say it like that, but like I guess it is. It's just if you're like a really rich gay person. Yeah, basically I just think that like fundamentally Diana Sihami doesn't understand modernism and even lesbian modernism as a particularly classed phenomenon, which it absolutely was. Like, I think that is capacity for there to have been modernist books and classics that were not so surrounded or created out of such classed privilege. But yeah, this particular kind of modernism that she's talking about, which she sees as the only kind of modernism, is, I feel like that's maybe not going to make much sense. If you have any questions like as I'm talking about this, please do not hesitate to ask, and hopefully I won't be as fucking unintelligible. Not that there's anything like inherently wrong with that necessarily, but like So I think the final kind of overall issue I had with it is just the way it's written is kind of weird. It's sort of, oh, I was holding it upside down. It's very just like descriptive. It just sort of says like this happened and this happened and this happened. And what also is weird is that sometimes we get these like excursions into like randomly we'll be hearing about somebody else's life and somebody else's relationship that's not really that connected to the people that the chapter is about. I think the worst chapters for it are, I mean, the Sylvia Beach chapter has just like a lot about James Joyce and Ulysses, which like I don't care about, and I did know, but the other chapter I think that suffers the most from it probably is the Natalie Clifford Barney chapter, which is basically just like this person slept with Natalie Clifford Barney, and then the person who slept with Natalie Clifford Barney slept with this person who slept with this person. Now we're randomly talking about this person's relationship. You know, it's just very weird, and like it doesn't feel like a particularly cohesive, good biography of any of the four people. I have been like pretty negative, I guess, so before I move on to talking more in depth about the specific people / sections, I thought I maybe would say some of like the good things about it. Because it wasn't uniformly bad, I'm not sure if I could find a book like this uniformly bad, but yeah. So one thing I really liked is the way it's written in sections. Like, even if I had a problem with how it was written, I did like how there's these like headings, and then there's like, yeah, like a sort of short section, and like the size of those sections vary, but they do tend to be pretty short. The longest is probably like 3 pages or something, and the shortest is like, yeah, like a paragraph. And yeah, so I did really like that. Made it really easy to read, which I did appreciate. And also there are quite a lot of pictures in this. Where's the picture of Bryher? I really like that one. Yeah, this is Bryher. Yeah, and there are other smaller pictures. Here's the Jewish lesbian photographer Giselle Freund. They're just like dotted about. I think that there's some really interesting stuff about Bryher, which I mean I guess is just like the nature of biography, but like Bryher's like kind of role in developing like experimental film. So I did really enjoy learning about that. And I also think as a book about like modernist publishing and like what it takes to publish a modernist book, and to some degree a little bit about censorship and the problems with that, and also the, yeah, just like print culture of modernism. This is also quite an interesting book in that respect, because especially in Sylvia Beach's section, because she was the owner of a bookshop, but she also published Ulysses. She was, yeah, very much part of that kind of like circulating modernist textual stuff. And same with Bryher, she financed a lot of like particular kinds of radical or experimental publishing groups and projects. I also enjoyed learning about how some of Gertrude Stein's work was created into like operas and plays and performances. I really want to see or like read a production of Dr. Faustus Lights the Lights, which is something that she wrote, but it's really hard to find, and I would really like to watch a production. But it was interesting learning about that process and the collaborative process of it. Alright, so I think the main thing I want to say about the Sylvia Beach chapter is that it just like uses the fact that she published Ulysses by James Joyce. So obviously that's like a big work in terms of modernism, especially like capital M, high modernism, but it uses that fact as a kind of demonstration of her like feminist credentials as an act of fighting against the patriarchy, which, you know, I mean, I guess you could sort of argue in terms of the fact that like it was censored a lot and she was trying to like open the pathway for something like that to be published. But the main like flaw in that is that like James Joyce treated her like shit basically the whole time. So it sort of feels very silly to be claiming that it's like a feminist act for her to have done that, when after she did publish it she was basically bankrupted, and then Joyce sold the rights to an American publisher and didn't give her any money, so she continued to be fairly bankrupted and was like massively taken advantage of, and, you know, put so much of her time, energy and resources into helping James Joyce both like write and publish the book. Got him money, got him people to type up his very badly written drafts, things like that. So yeah, it feels very silly to then turn around and be like, and that was feminism. Meanwhile Sylvia Beach is just like wrecked by the entire experience. And I just think it's really silly to like act as if Ulysses is like the apex of like feminist modernism. I don't think I need to say any more. Like, so in terms of Bryher's chapter, obviously like the major thing that runs through it is this like weird gender incongruence that is like, I mean, Bryher's own gender incongruence, but also the chapter's incongruence with it too. So like Suhaimi writes like, she identified as a feminist even while feeling she was at heart a man, but then like doesn't let that affect how she writes the rest of the chapter. It's really like a staggeringly cisgender approach to take, I feel like. It's just like really bizarre. And I think also something like that again is like kind of acknowledged, and obviously not really in the way that I think it should have been, but at the end of, or like nearer the end of Bryher's life, like she wrote these novels about like a 12-year-old boy in various different like historical places, not like a series but just like a bunch of books, and it seems like, you know, that was really an expression of herself. But again, like, and then I think partially through that, but then not entirely through that, I do feel like there is just a way that the chapter about Bryher just keeps you like at a distance, and it's a shame because Bryher obviously was quite interesting, but like, yeah, you get this weird sense of sort of like separation from Bryher's own like passions and loves, and it's partially I think the way that like her relationship with HD is written about, but I don't know, and it makes, I mean, it's hard to figure out what is true, obviously, because Diana Suhaimi has proven herself to be fairly untrustworthy. Yeah, it's hard to figure out if Bryher didn't have money that allowed HD to be supported, if like HD would have just left, you know, like, I don't know. And I mean, I feel sad about that because I want Bryher to have been happy and stuff, but I don't know. But I also think it's maybe like an example of where like Diana Suhaimi just doesn't really have a good hold on her biographical subjects. She doesn't like let herself really, aside from making particular decisions about what she keeps and what she doesn't actually like help you as a reader like be led through a life and like be close in that life. And yeah, I think that's an example of her like not very good writing and construction of this. Moving on to Natalie Clifford Barney's chapter, I think it's like pretty boring after a while. It's just basically like a sapphic Paris who slept through, which a lot of it I already knew. And I think like, you know, it's much more fun to read like Djuna Barnes's Lady's Almanack than to like read it in this book. Also, I think in that chapter she's desperately scrambling for content to write about Natalie Clifford Barney, because she skips out like a major part of her life, which is what happens during the Second World War to her, where she gets stuck in Florence with Romaine Brooks. Also, her political ideas and writings before then. So in terms of her time in Italy and during the war, and then also her particular brand of sort of anti-Semitism and Nazi sympathising and fascist leaning, I wanted to check my sources and stuff. So this is Wild Heart, A Life, Natalie Clifford Barney and the Decadence of Literary Paris by Suzanne Rodriguez. I did read a little bit of this for my undergrad dissertation, which is why I remembered it existed. This is about 20 years old. It was published in 2002 and it's obviously pretty easily available about Natalie Clifford Barney. I think if you are interested in her life, you should obviously pick this up and not this. But yeah, there's a whole chapter called War Redux 1939 to 1945, and I'm going to read you a bunch of stuff from it. Natalie was preoccupied with the publication of her 10th book, Nouvelles Pensées de l'Amazon. Published as Europe worried increasingly about war, the book garnered little attention. That is probably just as well, because despite its small gifts, the book is marred by Natalie's conservative political views and anti-Semitic statements. Trying to comprehend Natalie Barney's anti-Semitic writing is a frustrating exercise because it makes no sense. She's partly Jewish and wrote proudly at times of her Jewish heritage. Blah blah blah. Actually, Natalie's unsavoury writings neither began nor ended with Nouvelles Pensées. In 1904, aboard the Deutschland with her mother, she came on deck to find many energetic, undersized people, mostly of the Jewish form of countenance, madly promenading, one especially little man with a huge nose carrying ostentatiously, as though to disguise his origins, a volume largely lettered Buddha. Finds he his God therein when so obviously featured otherwise? Occasional epigrams in her earliest books show similar attitudes. What nation will love the Jews so well that they may stop being Jewish, she wrote in Éparpillement. Remarks emerged over the years regarding straightened Jewish noses, the Jews' burden of guilt for the death of Christ, the need for assimilation. For those who admire the personal courage and bold spirit that Barney exhibited so often throughout her life, it is difficult to deal with this unpalatable aspect of her character. But Natalie's writings are a part of who she was. Her failings cannot be ignored. Natalie's own family had been victimised by anti-Semitism. Alice, who's Natalie Clifford's mother, never made a secret of the fact that her father was one half Jewish, but she considered herself an Episcopalian like her husband. Such experiences should have made Natalie more sensitive to the subject of anti-Semitism, but that's not what happened. Instead, she decided, probably in an unconscious fashion, to both distance herself from and celebrate herself for her Jewish background. She felt that her 1/8 measure of Jewish blood was just enough to lend her a dash of exoticism. Those who knew her agreed. In Miss Barney was combined the trenchant grace of the American woman and Palestinian nonchalance, Lily Grammont said. Simultaneous to honouring what she liked about her ancestry, Natalie also rejected everything she viewed as a stereotype negative. Natalie may have been radical in her personal life, but politically she had always been a conservative. As she grew older, she became even more so. She couldn't care less about the political or other persuasions of those she knew, so they were a varied lot. Among her friends were socialist right-wingers and everything in between. In the mid to late 1930s, as the situation in Europe heated up, Natalie's personal views began to be swayed by her more conservative friends. She was far from politically astute, as those who knew her had been quick to point out. As war loomed and as rumours circulated of Hitler's attitude towards Jews, Natalie stopped discussing her Jewish heritage. Natalie's Jewish background was widely known. Anyone in France who possessed the slightest measure of Jewish blood worried about the Nazis' anti-Jewish rhetoric, with good reason, as it turned out. Ezra Pound was one of those whose political views influenced Natalie in the late 1930s. Pound's anti-Semitism had become so virulent, his political beliefs so extreme, that old friends dropped him. Not Natalie. It wasn't in her nature to drop friends to begin with, but she also agreed with much of what he said. And as I'm reading this out to you, I also do want to note that I do think some of the way that this talks about politics I don't agree with, but I do think that this is a much more responsible way to engage with the prevalence of anti-Semitic, but also just white supremacist and conservative right-wing and Nazi ideology and thoughts in the figure that you're biographizing, you know? Yeah, so basically she's like pretty influenced by Ezra Pound, who's like a massive fascist, and whilst like stuck in Florence with Romaine Brooks during the war, she was writing more and more anti-Semitic stuff. Like, if Benjamin Franklin could foresee that if we let the Jews in, we would risk being subjugated by them, why cannot we at least see this most real of the Semitic perils developing under our very eyes? In Italy, naturally enough, this is also where I'm like, really, I feel like some of this is sort of like hedging about how it was, so I'm gonna still read it. I think it's still a useful source. In Italy, naturally enough, wartime propaganda had a decidedly fascist slant. Axis victories and might were trumpeted, Allied victories were ignored or downplayed. The newspapers and radio constantly broadcast the government's point of view. Day in and day out, Natalie and Romaine heard the message, and they believed what they heard. They had no other input. By mid-1943, Italy had lost most of its army. When Mussolini was deposed and thrown in jail, crowds of anti-fascists came out of hiding to drag a statue of him through the streets. Right around this time, Natalie, like everyone else she knew, began to view the Allies as liberators. So, whilst I think I would maybe make some more particular, stronger kind of judgments about Natalie Clifford Barney's like politics from that, I do think that this is a great example of like at least talking about the particular political dimensions of her life and her political beliefs, and whether or not they actually genuinely shifted, or whether or not they actually genuinely did support, you know, Mussolini. I think it's very clear that like she did believe a lot of that like anti-Semitic stuff, and clearly saw her Jewish like identity was obviously must have been pretty scary, but like I think she obviously did see it as a kind of like way that thing that made her even more special, because she wasn't like those Jews, which I think is something that Gertrude Stein also sort of feels. But yes, anyway, so if you want to read about Natalie Clifford Barney, there's a better book that seems to be much better researched. Alright, now we're going to get to the Gertrude Stein section, which I think I have the most sources for. Whether or not I will talk the longest, because I have already been talking for a long time, and I am sorry about that. Before I talk more about the political stuff, because that is my main issue with the Gertrude Stein section, I thought I would just briefly go over some of the non-political issues I had. One of the main ones is just that like I feel like Gertrude Stein remains like opaque, which I think if you're just reading her work is something that is kind of true, because it, like I said before, it is quite difficult to pass, and like yeah, it does refuse conventional meaning. But I think as a person, like there's a way you can quite easily tap into her inner voice and her sense of self and all of this stuff. In fact, there's a book that I read a while ago, and I'm not sure how it deals with the like political elements, but I do feel like from reading it I got much more of a sense of like her as an actual person, and that's Paris Was a Woman by Andrea Weiss, which also accompanies like a film documentary that is also fun if you can get a hand of that. Again, I did watch that quite a few years ago. And the other thing that I think also gives you much more of like a strong flavour, even though it's like an article, is this great article called Gertrude Stein's War by Janet Malcolm. Everything that I've mentioned I will be leaving links to, or writing down all the sources in the description box, so check that if you're interested. Diana Suhaimi does do this thing where she just like quotes from Gertrude Stein's novels and stuff as if it's like directly about her life, and whether or not it's like autobiographical is sort of not the point. I think the point is that you can't just treat those two kinds of writing exactly the same. Yeah, I just thought that was like very bad practice. Okay, and then the last thing is just like, it's just one of my favourite like Gertrude Stein moments, which is that she just didn't include, and I think it's sad because it's like a great example of like a lesbian really directly affecting like writing, modernist writing. And that is an episode in the Stein-Toklas relationship where Alice B. Toklas, who was like Gertrude Stein's lifelong partner, finds a manuscript of a book called QED, which is about a love triangle that Gertrude Stein was in when she was in Johns Hopkins, I think, but like in the 1890s in America, with a woman called May Buxtaver, who was then like in a relationship with someone called like Mabel Haynes, I want to say. And basically like when they find the manuscript, Alice is like extremely angry and jealous about it, and in response to that she makes Gertrude change all of the word May in a particular poem called stanzas, something like stanzas on meditation, that sounds around right, which I think was written in about 1935 or something. There's more detail about this particular episode in both the book and also in the Gertrude Stein's War article if you want to read that. But yeah, basically she made Gertrude Stein change every iteration of the word may to can, or to like today or day if it was may as in like the 1st of May or something, and it makes the poem worse and is like a really incredible act of like petty lesbian, you know, drama or whatever. So yeah, anyway, she doesn't talk about that at all, which I think is a shame. But if you are interested in that episode, it's great. There's actually this, she sounds like a really incredible sort of Stein scholar called Ulla Dido, who had a dream that preempted her discovery of like why that had happened and like what that was about, which I thought was great. So in terms of the politics in the chapter on Gertrude Stein, Diana Suhami does talk a little bit about Gertrude Stein's beliefs about, you know, gender and politics and things like that, but she doesn't ever really go into detail, and she obviously is doing that as a way of obfuscating the level of conservative right-wing awfulness that Gertrude Stein believed in. Her sort of like weird misogynistic ideas and ideology is pretty evident from the very beginning. You know, she gives like this particular lecture in 1899 to a bunch of women. Actually, what I'm going to do is I'm going to read you a quote from a podcast. That podcast is the Bad Gays podcast by Hugh Lemmy and Ben Miller, I think. Again, I'll leave a link to it in the description box. They have a great episode about Gertrude Stein. I definitely recommend listening to it. It basically is going to say like exactly what I'm going to say. So on the podcast they say, Stein began to accept and define and understand her pseudo-masculinity through the ideas in a book by Otto Weininger called Sex and Character, which is from 1903. It's a crucial text of the kind of anti-feminist, masculinist, anti-sexological, sexually progressive early 20th century movements. So, and then what happens in No Modernism Without Lesbians is we do get a brief reference to Otto Weininger, but he is simply referred to as a Viennese psychologist, and then also he's like compared to people like Havelock Ellis and other sexologists who were a lot more progressive than Weininger. The quote from him that is in this is, "All women who are truly famous and are of conspicuous mental ability reveal some of the anatomical characters of the male, some bodily resemblance to a man." So Gertrude Stein's kind of like gender thought is a sort of like vulgar inversion theory that is basically really deeply misogynistic. But then also Weininger himself, again this is from the podcast, was Jewish by birth, but he considered Jewish men to be effeminate and women to be incapable of selfhood and genius, except he thought that some female homosexuals could approximate masculinity, and also male homosexuals, because they had nothing to do with women at all. Parts of his work were adapted by the Nazis, however the Nazis always denounced him and the text, but Stein ended up agreeing with him in that she would equate genius with masculinity, which makes it difficult then to engage in certain kinds of feminist interpretation of her work, which I like 100% agree with. What I feel is really cowardly and insidious is I do think that like Diana Suhami is doing a lot of this on purpose. She's making a lot of decisions about what to include and what not to include. And then also something that happens is throughout the other chapters, occasionally we get like a line about Gertrude Stein, and often they are to like downplay her beliefs. There's also a bit where she, during the Sylvia Beach chapter, which is like I think also the most interesting chapter in terms of like left-wing politics, because Sylvia Beach and Adrienne Monnier were helping like Jewish intellectuals and artists and things escape and giving them money, and you know, seemed pretty great. In that chapter she writes, like Gertrude Stein, in perverse times Adrienne cozied up to the enemy for life-saving favours, which I think is a mischaracterization of what happened. What happened is, during the Second World War, whilst Gertrude and Alice were living in occupied France, they were staying in a particular place and they had a friend who was a very high up guy in the structures of like the Vichy government, and he briefly gets a mention here. I'll read what they say about him here. Bernard Failly, translator of the autobiography of Alice B. Toklas into French, negotiated with Marshal Pétain, head of the Vichy regime that collaborated with the Axis powers to ensure their safety. He also secured extra rations for them of bread and petrol. He had been appointed head of the French collaborationist government at Vichy and was responsible for hundreds of Jews being sent to concentration camps. At the war's end, both Pétain and Failly were imprisoned for life as Nazi collaborators. Failly escaped to Switzerland. Pétain was exiled to the Ile d'Yeu off the Atlantic coast. He died there in 1951. So I really don't know how she does it. I just feel like it's like a really sort of, it's like you're supposed to brush through a lot of these facts and like not think of them as like important or like things that really fundamentally affect or change how you might feel about Gertrude Stein. But basically, in the piece that I previously referenced, Gertrude Stein's War by Janet Malcolm, I'm going to read what Janet Malcolm says about Bernard Failly, in case you don't know, / you can kind of get a sense of maybe some of the things that are missing from Diana Suhami's descriptions. So today I know that at least one of the people who came to see Stein and Toklas at Culoz was not a good guy, indeed was one of the very worst guys. Convicted of collaboration after the war and sentenced to a lifetime of hard labour, Bernard Fahy, a French university professor and writer, a gay man in his late 40s who came from a wealthy royalist Catholic family and whose right-wing connections led to his appointment in 1940 as head of the Bibliothèque Nationale, replacing a Jew. Fahy had been a close friend of Stein since the early 20s, and he had espoused the right-wing political views that he had all of that time. So Fahy has a memoir that he wrote called Les Précieux. I'm sorry if my pronunciation isn't good, in which he identified himself as Stein and Toklas's protector during the war. He acted as an advisor to Pétain, and he says this: "During this horrible period of occupation, misery and nascent civil war, my two friends lived a peaceful life. They didn't lack courage, they didn't lack intelligence, they didn't lack a sense of reality, and they didn't lack coal." Probably partially inspired by Fahy, Gertrude Stein in about 1941 began a project of translating some of Philippe Pétain, who's like the Marshal of Vichy France, his speeches into English so that she could publish them in America, which of course never happened. Because what audience is that for? And two Gertrude Stein scholars, one Ulla Dido, who I mentioned earlier, and Ed Burns, wrote what is difficult to understand about Gertrude Stein's fascination and love for Pétain, however, is how Stein continued with the project of translating his work once edicts against Jews were issued and deportations begun. According to the Bad Gays Gertrude Stein episode in about 1944, Gertrude Stein wrote that Pétain's policies were really wonderful, so simple, so natural, and so extraordinary. And that was what she wrote in the year that all the Jewish children in the town where she and Toklas resided were sent to Auschwitz and murdered. That is a quote from the podcast. And after the war, Gertrude Stein continued to praise Pétain in ways that were obviously unnecessary if it was about her survival and her fitting in. There's also this other article that I found by someone called Barbara Will, where she said that, so even after the war, Stein continued to praise Pétain, stating that his 1940 armistice with Hitler had achieved a miracle. This after Pétain had been sentenced to death by a French court for treason. So obviously there is also just this element of weird delusion to it, but I really don't think that you can write about her life and not include this kind of thing, because it's kind of repugnant and nauseating, but it's also clearly a part of her practice. And in that same Barbara Will essay, she talks about how Gertrude Stein did connect her experimental writing with the way that Pétain was controlling and ruling France at the time. So she sees a causality or a link between her work, and I think we should take that as to be accurate. I always think that one of the things that is a biggest indictment of Virginia Woolf's body of work is that she was put on the list that the Nazis made of writers and writing and texts that can be kept after we invade England. I feel that's her biggest shame, and I think a lot of modernists probably in the same boat, even if they weren't actively espousing fascist views. To go back to Bernard Fahy, who also was obviously a really repugnant and nauseating man, but was obviously also vital to the Vichy regime, which is again pretty intense. Yeah, there's also, so he was imprisoned after the war, right? And then he escaped. And in the Diana Suhaimi, it's a very short sentence, he escaped from Switzerland, full stop, and then we just move on. But the thing is, I don't know actually, I guess there's not loads of evidence, but there's evidence that Alice B. Toklas facilitated his escape, and she certainly wrote a whole bunch of letters trying to get him freed. In fact, in one letter she said, this is from November 1946 to the person who helped publish a bunch of Gertrude Stein's works, Carl van Vechten. She says, "He has been in Fresnes prison since the liberation, accused of hating communists, who doesn't, acting against the Masons, who wouldn't in France, hating the English, the large majority of Frenchmen do, hating the Jews. Is he alone? ? I think there are some facts about what he had done, which only came out quite a lot later, so I guess she doesn't know those things, but at the same time, this is pretty appalling stuff. And Alice B. Toklas did later convert to Catholicism and never seemed to really ever talk about her Jewishness. Obviously, I think a large part of Stein's reactionary conservative political views is because of her class position. Somebody said of her, who's called W.G. Rogers, I think he was an American friend, she was a rentier and possessed a rentier mentality. Going on to say, without her fixed income, we might never have heard of the Rue de Floreux, which is where she and Alice B. Toklas lived and held their fantastic literary and artistic salons. And I think that's a really like accurate point. Again, like I was saying, I think like modernism, the modernism that we think of as the major modernism, I mean, hopefully I'm going to make a video about this too later, so you know, maybe if you have no idea what I'm saying, hopefully I'll explain it in that one. But but I do think that like we have an idea of modernism as like this hero's journey. Gertrude Stein can just about sweep into that, partially because she, you know, was so like aggressively connected with conservatism, including in her relationship with Alice B. Toklas, who was like the wife, which allowed her to be like the male genius. But it's also very clear from, again, doing this research, that like Gertrude Stein didn't really seem to like have a handle on politics. But I also don't think that you can say that and sort of like that be the justification for her espousing all of this awful stuff. So, but you know, I guess it's part of it. Like in 1934, she was arguing that Hitler should get the Nobel Peace Prize, and she said this: "I say Hitler ought to have the Peace Prize because he is removing all elements of contest and struggle from Germany. By driving out the Jews and the democratic left elements, he is driving at everything that conduces to activity. That means peace." Like, who writes that? It's just bizarre. And I mean, I think it's also important to say that like Gertrude Stein's entanglement with these kinds of politics and her work for like the Vichy government and things like that, her connections there, her work as like a propagandist, have been known to scholars since like the 1970s. You know, they've been included in biographies of hers, and this is also referenced in a Barbara Will article. But it's just that these haven't like necessarily kind of punctured the public consciousness about her, or like in reference to her, and I think that's really bad. And I mean, that's why like this could have been a corrective to all of that misinformation or like erasure, but instead it goes the other way and decides to completely not engage with it at all. Sorry about the lighting, I'm gonna go try and sort that. Sorry, that is so much better. In Janet Malcolm's article, she does kind of go on to suggest that maybe after the Second World War, Gertrude Stein has kind of developed and like moved away from her kind of like childish and foolish and oversimplified understandings of politics. But she did die in 1946, so I guess we just like don't really know. I mean, I also am not really that convinced, but I do think it's interesting. She says, she cites this particular like incident where her friend W.G. Rogers, who I quoted from earlier, sent her corn from Spain during the Civil War, but like Gertrude Stein supported Franco, and also so did a bunch of her friends, and so the person who did that was saying like, don't share this corn with like a bunch of loyalists. And Gertrude was like, but why not? If the fascists like it and we like the fascists, so I said please send us unpolitical corn, which obviously is extremely annoying thing to say. But then Janet Malcolm writes this: but 6 years later, writing to Rogers from Vichy France, Stein humbly acknowledges her error. Of the corn she is planting in her garden, she now writes, and it is allied corn, you may be sure. So yeah, I guess I'm gonna leave that there. But you can obviously decide how you feel about all of this stuff, but I obviously have my own like particular feelings and thoughts. Yeah, I think that's sort of some of the like, I don't know, not really myth busting, but like kind of fact checking, I guess, that I wanted to do. You know, I think the 3 articles or like sources that I quoted from, the Janet Malcolm article, the Barbara Wells article, and then also the Bad Gays podcast, they all are able to engage with politics like with a complexity that Diana C. Hamey just cannot get to at all, which maybe is why she didn't talk about it at all. But I mean, right, a book about a different subject then, because it's a really important part of history and these people's lives. I think that's everything that I have to say. I hope this video doesn't end up being really long. I've been recording for a long time. Definitely let me know your thoughts about this, and like I said, if you have any questions, I'll definitely try to answer them. I mean, if there are lots of questions about modernism, I guess I could make like a fun answer video, because I do like talking about this stuff a lot, obviously. I hope you're having a nice day when you watch this, and I will talk to you when I next talk to you. Bye. And I'm really sorry about the lighting. I can't believe I just didn't think to switch the light on anyway.